So I think we're camera ready here at the Left Forum. This is a panel on what war is this a permanent occupation of Iraq? And it's extremely fitting that we are right up on the 9th anniversary of shock and awe, the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. I, for one, have not been at the first day of the Left Forum for years because it's always coincided with national protests against the Iraq War every single year for the last 4 years. We've been running in here after the protests in Washington for the second day, and today we're marking this terrible anniversary. Led to 1 million deaths of civilians, 4.5 million displaced, the destruction of a society and a country in our name. And notwithstanding that there are very few people in the room with us yet, we're doing this out of the essential necessity of speaking to what it is that's been done by the United States to Iraq, what continues to be done in Afghanistan, and what may happen any moment to the people of Iran. I am Deborah Sweet. I'm with World Can't Wait and War Criminals Watch. And this panel is a project of War Criminals Watch because we're never going to forget the war crimes that were done and the people responsible at the top of the Bush regime and now the Obama administration for carrying out this invasion and occupation. To my right is David Swanson, the author of War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War, his new book, writes on warisacrime.org and don'tattackiran.org and many other websites. To his right is Larry Everest, who has written a number of books over the last decades, most recently Oil, Power, and Empire, about the U.S. agenda in Iraq and the Middle East. He's a writer for Revolution newspaper, and he's going to be presenting at the end. And then on the far right is Michael Otterman.
It's the other way.
He's also published several books, and the relevant one to our discussion today is called Erasing Iraq. He's been a voice of conscience on what the U.S. has done to Iraq for years, and we're very glad to have these three people who have a great deal of background and expertise and passion for the subject to come and speak to us. So I think what we will do is start out with David, and then we'll have Michael, and we'll end with Larry, and then of course we'll have some time for discussion with among the panelists and with people watching. So here we are, 9 years. Is this a permanent occupation? And David Swanson is going to present first.
Thanks, Deborah. I am honored to be sitting here with these panelists, and people are going to be, if this is like the last panel, people are going to be coming in all through, and it'll be full by the time we're done. We have a panel on peace at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning in the big hall, the big auditorium, and I would encourage some people to get there before 11. When I lived in this city 20 years ago, the U.S. was beginning a 20-year war on Iraq. We protested at the United Nations. The Miami Herald depicted Saddam Hussein as a giant fanged spider attacking the United States. Hussein was very frequently compared to Adolf Hitler. On October 9th, 1990, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl told a U.S. congressional committee that she'd seen Iraqi soldiers take 15 babies out of an incubator in a Kuwaiti hospital and leave them on the cold floor to die. Some Congress members, including the late Tom Lantos, Democrat from California, knew but did not tell the U.S. public that the girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States and that she had been coached by a major U.S. public relations company paid by the Kuwaiti government, and that there was no other evidence whatsoever for the story. President George H.W. Bush used the dead babies story 10 times in the next 40 days, 7 senators used it in the Senate debate on whether to authorize military action. The Kuwaiti disinformation campaign for the first Gulf War would be successfully reprised by Iraqi groups favoring the overthrow of the Iraqi government 12 years later. My congressman in Virginia from 2008 to 2010, Tom Perriello, who was beloved by all the national progressive groups for reasons never explained, and who is now president of the Center for American Progress Action Fund and one of the founders of Avaz, holds up the first Gulf War as a model of a good and humanitarian war, while Avaz pushes for war in Syria as philanthropy, and Senator John McCain pushes for it as a way to overthrow a government that is aligned with Iran, the same Iran strengthened by the 20 years of war and sanctions against Iraq. All the lies that have to be told to get these wars going, are they a necessary part of a process of stirring up weak souls' emotions for the truly necessary and noble work of war? Are we all, each and every one of us, wise and knowing insiders who must tolerate being lied to because others just don't understand? This line of thinking would be more persuasive if wars did any good that could not be done without them, and if they did it without all the harm. 2 intense wars and many years of bombings and deprivation later, the evil ruler of Iraq, the former U.S. ally Saddam Hussein, is gone. But we've spent trillions of dollars, 1 million Iraqis are dead, 4 million have been displaced and left desperate and abandoned. Violence is everywhere, sex trafficking on the rise, basic infrastructure of electricity, water, sewage, and health care in ruins, in part because of U.S. intentions to privatize Iraq's resources for profit. Life expectancy dropped, cancer rates in Fallujah surpassed Hiroshima. Anti-U.S. terrorist groups are using the occupation of Iraq as a recruiting tool. There's not a functioning government, and most Iraqis say they were better off with Saddam Hussein in power. We have to be lied to for this. I was back in New York on February 15, 2003 to oppose the new assault on Iraq. That effort, the single biggest day of protest in history, created international alliances, prevented the United Nations from sanctioning the war, dragged non-anti-war groups into the anti-war effort, at least as long as the president was a Republican, discouraged military recruitment, and kicked off a movement that eventually ended a war in Iraq, with a great deal of help from the Iraqis, and is about to end a war in Afghanistan if we do the right things now, and has thus far prevented a war on Iran, a war that the masters of war have tried very hard to start a number of times in the past 9 years. Of course, the war on Iraq has neither ended completely nor ended the way people are often told it ended. This is old, but I got an email from the Huffington Post telling me that Obama was keeping his campaign promise to get U.S. troops out of Iraq. What Obama had actually promised was this, quote, "I will promise you this, that if we have not gotten out, if we have not gotten our troops out by the time I am president, it is the first thing I will do. I will get our troops home. We will bring an end to this war. You can take that to the bank," end quote. Here's how the Huffington Post claimed this promise was kept. Quote, "Fulfilling a long-held campaign promise, President Barack Obama announced Friday that he will pull all U.S. troops out of Iraq by the end of the year, as conditioned by the status of forces agreement with the country," end quote. Now, what exactly is a long-held campaign promise? Is it one that it takes you a long time to keep? Does that work even if the promise was specifically what your first action in office would be? Was this somehow Obama's belated first action? Of course not. This was compliance with a treaty that Bush and Maliki had made 3 years earlier, which the Iraqi government had refused to modify to accommodate Obama's desire to keep troops in Iraq longer. That refusal, specifically the refusal to allow mercenaries and troops immunity from Iraqi law, was apparently motivated in part by the release of the collateral murder video allegedly given to WikiLeaks by Bradley Manning, whom Obama kept in solitary confinement for a year and whom Obama's subordinates will now provide with the pretense of a trial following Obama's public declaration of his guilt. The vast bulk of the U.S. occupation of Iraq is gone, much to the credit of the Iraqis and of the peace movement that existed in the United States 3, 4, and 5 years ago, when peace groups were joined by democratic groups that saw an advantage in opposing a particular war. But the United States had already built the world's largest so-called embassy, until it completes a bigger one in Afghanistan. And the treaty that Bush and Maliki rammed through without the Congress, as Obama consequently believes he can do for Afghanistan, only required the removal of troops employed by the U.S. Department of so-called defense. Mercenaries employed by the State Department as well as the CIA can stay. In February, the State Department said it would be cutting its staff from 16,000 to 8,000. 8,000 staff for an embassy. Thousands of those staff will be nothing other than armed mercenaries. The U.S. Army has also hired mercenaries to escort shipments of supplies from Kuwait into Iraq, although it also has use of an airport in Iraq. The United States has a military presence in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Eritrea, Djibouti, Turkey, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean Sea, plus a closely aligned and U.S.-funded military in Israel. And there are those in the U.S. government who want to bring back a larger occupation of Iraq, while President Obama does not hesitate to send drones anywhere. As U.S. troops have been withdrawn, step by step, from Iraq, a number of things have not happened. Iraq has not descended into the worst hell imaginable, many times worse than the hell we've helped to create there. The reputation of the U.S. military has not collapsed to the point where every little nation with a grudge to settle has attacked Washington. The people of Iraq have not risen up to demand a longer occupation. The U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq have not come back from their graves to insist that their memories require additional years of pointless killing and dying by others. And the rule of law has not suffered a fatal blow, in part because it was already dead. All of this suggests a few things. One, it is possible that sometimes Fox News is wrong. Two, it is possible that the 2/3 of us who favor withdrawing from Afghanistan are right about that one as well. Three, maybe keeping the peace movement going would have been a good idea, and maybe we should revive it. Not gone from Iraq are ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell. They didn't get everything they'd hoped for, and Chinese, Russian, and Singaporean companies are there too, but they got hugely valuable contracts that give them far more profit and the Iraqi people far less than is the norm. They also raked in huge profits from the increased price of oil during the war, as during the current threat of war with Iran. Also profiting, of course, have been the direct war profiteers, the weapons makers, and other military contractors and mercenary firms. But outside of that group, which tends to profit enormously from military spending whether or not there's a war, the U.S. economy as a whole has been badly hurt. From the 99% to the 1%, even Donald Trump wants out of Afghanistan. This kind of madness doesn't benefit the conquering nation. I recently read an article about Iraq choosing to buy crops from nations other than the United States that quoted U.S. farmers who were absolutely furious that Iraq would choose not to buy their products after the United States had gone to so much trouble bombing and occupying Iraq. Michael Frumkin recently wrote, quote, "The population of Iraq is about 32 million. So that means the war cost us about $25,000 per Iraqi. I think my suggestion back in 2003 that instead of staying in Iraq, we just give every Iraqi $3,000 per year for the next year or two is looking awfully good in retrospect," end quote. Of course, that model could be enlarged. Far more Afghan children starve and freeze to death than any soldier's massacre, and it would cost a lot less to feed and clothe them than it does to massacre them. And doing so would create a lot more peace and stability. $1 trillion army cannot win an occupation. There is no such thing as winning. That's what Iraq ought to have shown them. There will be no nuclear weapons moved into Afghanistan and no U.S.-controlled pipelines. Apart from the weapons makers and mercenary profiteers, nobody gains. We in the United States didn't just lose money in Iraq. We lost our civil liberties at home, our representative government, our vestigial restrictions on presidential war powers. Obama went into Libya without even bothering to lie to Congress, and Leon Panetta this week told Senator Sessions that Obama can go into Syria without Congress or the United Nations. We lost our prohibitions on torture, murder, and lawless imprisonment. We lost religious tolerance. We lost the idea that there is anything presidents can do other than sex that can get them impeached. We created temporary despots. The authorizations to use military force from 2001 and the Iraq one from 2003 are still on the books. Obama and another president or Congress could send drones or troops into Iraq. The Iraq authorization to use military force is broader than the Afghanistan one. Bush and Obama have used it to justify worldwide war on people they label terrorists who do not have any plausible connection to September 11th, and to wiretap the rest of us. And the Congress voted down ending that authorization just because they're ending the war it authorized. We also lost in Iraq all credibility as supporters of the rule of law. Those who had seen immunity effectively given to the killers of Haditha knew what to expect when the Afghan government demanded an open trial in Afghanistan for the killer of Kandahar. We lost all sense of gratitude and requirement of protection for whistleblowers as Obama has expanded on Bush's approach of treating them as traitors. We lost the goodwill of much of the world. We became hated, loathed, despised, detested. Some of those in power in the United States recovered a reluctance to launch huge wars and lose lots of U.S. military lives, but they found an alternative in bombs and drones. And if relatively few drone pilots lose their minds or kill themselves, that doesn't mean there won't be blowback, or that there is not a direct cost to our culture becoming an empire that uses robots to kill. The damage to U.S. veterans, their families, and those around them will go on for decades. The brain damage, PTSD, and suicide epidemics just begin to tell the story of human and financial cost. The divorce, child neglect, and child abuse will be long-lasting, not to mention the desire of many of those children to please their parents by going to wars themselves. Unbeknownst to the U.S. media, of course, the bulk of the cost of a war is borne by the nation where the war is fought. On the question of what has been done to Iraq, I highly recommend Michael Otterman's book, Erasing Iraq. Last year, we watched the people of Egypt overthrow a U.S.-backed dictator in 3 weeks at a cost of 300 deaths. They only overthrew the one individual, not the corrupt military government. They have a long ways to go. But compare Iraq. Over 20 years, the United States has replaced a dictator with a corrupt military government at a cost of millions of lives, trillions of dollars spent, trillions of dollars in infrastructure destroyed, a regional refugee crisis, ethnic and religious strife, segregated towns and neighborhoods, empowered religious fanatics. We've set back women's rights, effectively eliminated gay and lesbian rights, nearly killed off some minority groups, decimated the nation's cultural heritage, and created a generation of people without the experience of peace, without education, without proper nutrition, without tolerance, without health care, without a functioning government, and without affection or even indifference to our country. What a bargain. Surely nonviolence could never have done so much. Or as Obama put it when accepting his Nobel Peace Prize just after rejecting the model of Martin Luther King Jr., quote, "Negotiations cannot convince al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. To say that force is sometimes necessary is not a call to cynicism. It is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason," end quote. Well, imperfections of somebody. In place of reason, the war on Iraq gave us this, as recounted by U.S. soldier Ethan McCord, quote, "We had a pretty gung-ho commander who decided that because we were getting hit by IEDs a lot, there would be a new battalion SOP, standard operating procedure. He goes, quote, if someone in your line gets hit with an IED, 360 rotational fire, you kill every motherfucker on the street, end quote. Another way to kill every motherfucker on the street is to destroy water supplies, sewage plants, hospitals, and bridges. This we have done most extensively in 1991 and 2003. On the first occasion, a U.S. Air Force planning officer justified these criminal acts as no worse and having no other purpose than economic sanctions. Quote, people say you didn't recognize that it was going to have an effect on water or sewage. Well, what were we trying to do with sanctions? Help out the Iraqi people? No. What we were doing with the attacks on infrastructure was to accelerate the effects of the sanctions, end quote. Sanctions on Iran are for the same purpose. Either they will provoke Iran just as they did Japan these many years ago, or they will create a logic that explains war on the grounds that the sanctions haven't succeeded in overthrowing a sovereign government that we haven't overthrown since 1953. The Madeleine Albrights of the world who thought that killing 500,000 Iraqi children was a price worth paying for some strategic purpose need to be asked now, Now that the strategic purpose has presumably been achieved or been abandoned, why in the hell are we not making reparations to the Iraqi people? We have not built them a nation. We haven't built anyone a nation unless you count Germany and Japan, which we first burned to the ground and have since never left. Supposedly we built a nation in Grenada and another over a mere 23 years in Panama, although I'm not convinced that both wouldn't have been better off left alone. Nobody claims we built a nation in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, or Iraq. Well, maybe some do, but they don't live there. Half the world's refugees are from Afghanistan and Iraq. Possibly half the world's torture victims are from Afghanistan and Iraq. We owe reparations. Instead, with the crime ending in Iraq, its architects are on book tours instead of trial. Their successor in the White House has embraced the lies. The lie that invading Iraq was about so-called weapons of mass destruction, and the lie that escalating the war on Iraq helped to win it. These lies are carried over as lessons for Afghanistan and elsewhere. It is critical that we continue to counter them. U.S. polling on belief that the Iraq war was based on lies paralleled and led polling on opposition to that war. But memories are short. We have a great deal to be gained from continually reminding our country of the lies. George Galloway, the great former British member of Parliament, recently wrote, quote, "I told Tony Blair, outside the men's lavatory in the library corridor of the House of Commons, to be precise, that the fall of Baghdad would not be the beginning of the end, but merely the end of the beginning, and that the Iraqis would fight them with their teeth if necessary until they had driven them from their land. I told Blair that there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but that if he and Bush were to invade, there would be thousands of them. But two things, as George W. Bush would put it, I misunderestimated. First, that when the tower of lies on which the case for the Iraq war had been constructed was exposed, the credibility of the political systems of the two main liars would collapse under the weight. And second, that the example of the Iraqi resistance would trigger seismic changes in the Arabian landscape from Marrakesh to Bahrain. Almost nobody in Britain or America any longer believes a word their politicians say. This profound change is not wholly the result of the Iraq war, but it moved into top gear following the war and the militarized mendacity that paved the way to it. In America, this malaise has fueled both the Tea Party phenomenon and the Occupy movement alike, even if the word Iraq seldom crosses their lips. And from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf, the plates are moving still." End quote. Yes, but here in the land of the free, people have a tendency to believe their government lies about everything except war. That it lies about war too, we need constantly to remind each other. In that spirit, I will close with this, and I have drafted what I take to be the top 10 lying, scheming reasons to treat Iran the way we treated Iraq. 1, Iran has threatened to fight back if attacked, and that's a war crime, and war crimes must be punished. 2, my television says Iran has nukes. I'm sure it's true this time, just like with North Korea. I'm sure they're next. We only bomb places that really truly have nukes and are in the axis of evil, except Iraq, which was different. 3, Iraq didn't go so badly. Considering how lousy its government is, the place is better off with so many people having left or died. Really, that one couldn't have worked out better if we'd planned it. 4, when we threaten to cut off Iran's oil, Iran threatens to cut off Iran's oil, which is absolutely intolerable. What would we do without that oil? And what good is buying it if they want to sell it? 5, Iran was secretly behind 9/11. I read it online. And if it wasn't, that's worse. Iran hasn't attacked another nation in centuries, which means its next attack is going to come very soon. 6, Iranians are religious nuts, unlike Israelis and Americans. Most Israelis don't want to attack Iran, but the holy Israeli government does, and to oppose that decision would be to sin against God. 7, Iranians are so stupid that when we murder their scientists, they try to hire a car dealer in Texas to hire a drug gang in Mexico to murder a Saudi ambassador in Washington, and then they don't do it just to make us look bad for catching them. 7, Part B. Oh, and stupid people should be bombed. They're not civilized. 8, war is good for the U.S. economy and the Iranian economy too. Troops stationed in Iran would buy stuff. And women who survived the war would have more rights, like in Virginia. We owe Iranians this after that little mishap in 1953. 9, this is the only way to unite the region. Either we bomb Iran and it swears its eternal love to us, or if necessary, we occupy Iran to liberate it like its neighbors, which shouldn't take that long. Look how well Afghanistan is going already. Number 10, they won't give our drone back. Okay.
Wow.